They said she laughed at all the wrong things, at funerals, at sermons, even when her mother cried. A strange, high sound that didn't fit the air, a sound too bright for a place like that. Her name was Sarah Ann, the child no one wanted to claim. Born to the master's son and a woman who wasn't free, she wandered between two worlds that both turned their backs on her. She didn't understand cruelty the way adults did, but she understood attention. And every time they called her simple, every time they told her to be quiet, she laughed louder. Until one day she laughed at something she shouldn't have, and the sound that had followed her since birth finally disappeared. They said the plantation was quieter after that, but no one ever forgot the echo of that last laugh. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre record and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back to Mississippi, 1851. The first time they heard her laugh, it was early morning, before the sun had burned the mist off the fields. The sound came drifting from the slave quarters, thin and strange, a giggle that didn't belong in a place where no one had reason to laugh. Old Ruth, the cook, dropped her ladle when she heard it. "That ain't right," she muttered. "That's a sound don't fit the air." By the time the overseer's wife came to the door, the noise had stopped. But later, it came again, faint, uneven, like a song that didn't know its tune. It rose and fell with the rhythm of work, a child's laughter spilling out between the cracks of the day. The men in the field said it made the mules nervous. The women said it carried too far, that it could be heard even when the wind blew east. Some swore it echoed from the river at night. Her name was Sarah Ann, and she was 7 years old, too young to understand the weight of things, too old to be innocent of them. She lived on the edge of the quarters, in a cabin that smelled of smoke and damp earth. Her mother, Dinah, worked the laundry line behind the big house. No one spoke of who her father was, but everyone knew. The master's boy had that same sharp jaw and the same restless eyes. Sarah Ann wasn't like the other children. She didn't cry when scolded, didn't run when chased. Instead, she laughed, a soft, breathy sound that made grown men uneasy. When someone tripped or cursed, when a pot shattered, when someone whispered a prayer too long, she'd laugh. Not mockingly, not joyfully either. It was something in between. Once a woman asked her, "Child, what's so funny?" Sarah had looked up, her eyes wide and bright as river glass. "Ain't funny," she'd said. "It just sound like it ought to be." By sundown, the laughter had spread through every mouth in the quarters, not in sound, but in talk. Some said the girl was simple, others said she saw things no one else could. One man crossed himself and said she was touched by spirits, which earned him a slap from his wife for speaking such words out loud. That night, as the frogs began their song and the whippoorwills took over the air, the laughter came again. Fainter this time, slower. It rose from the shadows near the well, then drifted toward the magnolia grove. No one went to look. And by morning, when the bell rang for work, Sarah Ann was sitting outside her cabin, her knees drawn to her chest, humming softly, that same broken tune that wasn't quite a song. No one said a word to her. But every time she smiled, someone nearby stopped smiling back. By midsummer, everyone on the plantation had learned to listen for the sound before they saw her. It was always the same, a soft hum, followed by that little giggle, light as a feather but sharp enough to cut through the thick, humid air. Then she'd appear, barefoot and dusty, her hair a tangle of wild curls, standing by the split-rail fence that separated the field hands from the house. Sarah Ann liked to sit there, right where she wasn't supposed to. The fence wasn't just wood and nails, it was a border between two worlds, and she belonged to neither. On one side, the housefolk called her that half-child, the proof of sin that walked and talked and didn't know its place. On the other side, the field hands whispered that she carried a curse, that her laugh could bring rain or ruin depending on who heard it first. But Sarah didn't care. She'd swing her legs and make faces at anyone who passed by. Sometimes she'd mimic the overseer's barked orders in a perfect imitation, sending the older boys into fits of nervous laughter until they saw him coming and scattered. Other times she'd repeat the master's wife's prayers word for word, her childish voice dipping into mock holiness, eyes wide with a strange sort of delight. "Stop that, girl," her mother would hiss when she caught her. "You'll get yourself beat if you keep talking like that." Sarah would just shrug. "Ain't doing nothing," she'd say, her grin slipping into a whisper. "Just sounding like folks." Her mother tried to keep her close, but Sarah had a way of slipping off, like smoke, like mischief, like someone who never quite touched the ground. One afternoon, Ruth the cook spotted her standing outside the smokehouse, watching two of the older women argue. When one raised her hand, Sarah burst out laughing. The fight froze mid-motion. The women turned, and the one with the raised hand lowered it slowly. "Ain't right," she muttered. "A child laughing at hurt." But Sarah wasn't laughing at them. She was laughing through it, that odd musical sound that didn't belong anywhere. Later, when her mother pulled her away and demanded to know why she did it, Sarah just said, "It sound funny, Mama. They're yelling so loud it don't sound like words no more, just noise." Her mother looked at her for a long time before whispering, "Noise like that get people hurt, baby. You stop hearing what's real when you play with sorrow." But Sarah didn't understand. Or maybe she did, and that's what scared her. Because the next morning, when the sun rose red and thick over the fields, she was sitting by that same fence again, humming softly, her head tilted as if listening to something no one else could hear. And when a bird fell from the tree above her, dead before it hit the ground, she laughed again, a small, hollow sound that sent chills through everyone who heard it. The truth of Sarah Ann's blood was the kind of secret that everyone knew, and no one dared to name aloud. It sat between the house and the quarters like a bruise that never faded, tender and ugly, no matter how many times it was covered up. Her father was Mr. Henry, the master's only son, 23, spoiled and half drunk most of his waking hours. When Sarah was born, he had been gone upstate on business, and when he returned, the baby was already walking. The first time he saw her, he froze mid-step, staring as though he were seeing himself in a dream he couldn't wake from. The resemblance was too sharp to deny, the same straight nose, the same restless eyes that darted like they were always half expecting a blow. The master's wife had gone pale at the sight of the girl. "She's a reminder," she'd whispered later, her voice tight, "of sin, of shame." So Sarah was kept at a distance. The house never said her name, the quarters said it too often. When she wandered too close to the front porch, the housemaid would hiss her back like a stray cat. And when Henry stumbled past her on his way to the stables, he'd avert his eyes, as though if he didn't look, she might vanish. But Sarah noticed. She noticed everything. Sometimes she'd sneak behind the smokehouse to watch him work his horse, his sleeves rolled, his hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. Once she mimicked his voice perfectly, repeating his curses under her breath. He heard her and turned, and for the first time their eyes met. "What did you say?" he asked. Sarah froze, her little hands clutching the fence rail. Then she smiled, that same disarming, too-old smile, and said, "I sound like you." Henry stared at her for a long time. "Don't you ever say that again," he said, his voice low, trembling with something he didn't have a name for. She tilted her head. "Why not?" "Because I said so." Then he turned and left, but his hands were shaking when he reached for the reins. That evening, the mistress told the cook that she didn't want that girl anywhere near the house again. "She's making a mockery of this place," she said, her voice cold as glass. "She laughs at everything, even at me." The next morning, Sarah found a rag doll sitting by the fence post, new, clean and handmade. She knew who it came from. She held it for a long time, her laughter quiet that day, her eyes following the path to the big house. And later, when her mother asked where she got it, she whispered, "From the man who don't like me." Her mother froze. "Child, you don't know what kind of danger that is." Sarah nodded slowly. "I do," she said, "but I think he don't." Then she began to hum again, low and strange, while the sun went down behind the magnolia trees. By late July, the air on the Calder plantation felt thicker than heat. It was the kind of heavy that made every sound carry and every silence feel watched. Sarah Ann's laughter, that thin silver thread that once drifted through the fields, now seemed to follow people wherever they went. It started with small things. A mule startled and broke its reins when she passed by. A water bucket cracked clean down the middle after she touched it. Then came the lightning strike. a flash in the middle of a clear day that split the old pecan tree beside the smokehouse. The men in the fields looked up at the sound, muttered prayers under their breath, and one of them said what everyone had been thinking. "That laugh's calling something bad." From then on, her name was spoken only in whispers. The field hands began crossing themselves when she walked by. Mothers pulled their children away when she appeared. Even the older boys who used to tease her stopped, looking over their shoulders as if her giggle might cling to them. Ruth, the cook, tried to warn the others. "She's just a baby," she said. "Ain't no devil in that child. She's different, that's all." But the others only shook their heads. "Different don't mean safe," one replied. Sarah noticed the way people moved around her, the way they stopped laughing, the way eyes slid away when she looked up. But she didn't understand why, so she laughed louder. One afternoon, she wandered into the fields, barefoot and curious, watching the women stoop low to pick cotton. The hum of their work filled the air, steady, rhythmic, tired. Sarah squatted beside one of them and mimicked the motion, plucking a bowl and smiling when the sharp edge pricked her finger. "It bit me," she said, and then she laughed. The woman flinched, dropped her handful of cotton, and crossed herself. "Go on, girl. Don't bring that here." Sarah stood, confused. "I didn't do nothing." "You best go home," the woman said, not looking at her. "Go home before you make something happen." Sarah turned slowly, her small shoulders stiff. As she walked back toward the fence, the laughter caught in her throat, not joy, not teasing, just habit. But that habit was enough. The next morning, one of the men slipped with his blade and cut his hand deep. Blood spattered across the cotton, bright and shocking. He hissed through his teeth and spat on the ground. "Told y'all," he said. "That child's laugh is cursed." That night, her mother found a rough sign scratched into the dirt outside their cabin door. 2 crooked X's crossed through a circle, a mark meant to ward off evil. Dinah rubbed it away with her foot, her heart pounding. When she looked up, Sarah was sitting on the steps, swinging her legs, humming softly to herself. "What you hummin', baby?" Sarah smiled faintly. The sound the tree made when it broke, and then she laughed again, soft, steady, and wrong against the still night. The mistress of the house, Mrs. Margaret Calder, had spent her life trying to keep everything polished, her manners, her silver, her reputation. She ruled over the plantation with a quiet kind of cruelty, the kind that smiled while it drew blood. And she despised Sarah Ann. It wasn't because of what the child did, it was because of what the child was. Every time Margaret saw her, that little brown face with Henry's eyes and her husband's jawline, it felt like a confession she hadn't made, a humiliation she couldn't undo. She said little about it at first, but her silence was sharp enough. The servants understood that Sarah was to stay out of sight when the mistress walked the grounds. But Sarah didn't understand rules that lived in whispers. One morning, while the house was preparing for a Sunday visit from the Reverend, Sarah wandered up the path, humming to herself. She stopped near the veranda, her bare feet streaked with dust, and began mimicking the way the mistress spoke. "Mr. Calder, do try to look pious this week," she said in her small, sing-song voice, drawing out the words in perfect imitation. "We mustn't let the Reverend think we're heathens." The field hands nearby froze. One woman dropped her basket, another hissed through her teeth. And then the laughter came, that small, breathless giggle that didn't sound like joy. When Mrs. Calder stepped out and saw her, the world seemed to hold its breath. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, her tone cold and cutting. Sarah stopped laughing, but the smile stayed. "I was talking like you," she said simply. The mistress blinked, and for a moment her composure faltered. "Like me?" Sarah nodded. "You sound like when thunder's coming, but it ain't here yet." It was the strangest compliment the woman had ever received, and somehow the most insulting. Her hand shot out faster than thought, striking the girl across the face. The sound was small, just skin on skin, but it seemed to echo through the still air. "Get that child out of my sight," she hissed. Dinah came running, wrapping her arms around her daughter, but Sarah didn't cry. She just looked up at the mistress, eyes wide, cheek red, and whispered, You sound louder when you mad." That night the house was filled with silence so heavy it seemed to press on the walls. The next morning the mistress called for the overseer and said, "Keep her down near the quarters. I don't want that child anywhere near me again." From that day on, Sarah's laughter could no longer be heard near the house, but it still drifted through the fields, softer now, like a song the wind carried only to those who didn't want to hear it. The summer of 1851 brought dust, drought, and a stranger to the Calder plantation. Her name was Miss Eloise Wren, a missionary school teacher from Savannah sent by the church to bring Christian education to the enslaved. The mistress welcomed her with tea and polite condescension, speaking of the good she might do among the simple folk. When Miss Wren first met Sarah Ann, she thought the girl was a servant's child who had wandered where she shouldn't. Sarah stood barefoot in the doorway of the schoolroom, eyes fixed on the slate board, head tilted as though listening to a sound no one else could hear. "You must be one of the little ones to be taught," Miss Wren said brightly. Sarah smiled faintly. "I already know how to talk like you." The teacher blinked, then frowned slightly. "You mean you wish to learn to speak properly, dear?" Sarah shook her head. Then, in the teacher's own clipped accent, she said, "Good morning, children. Today we'll learn to spell grace." Her voice was exact, the tone, the rhythm, even the breath between words. Miss Wren's smile faltered. "That's quite a trick," she said. Sarah tilted her head again, her eyes darting between the chalk, the teacher, and the window light. "Ain't no trick," she whispered. "It's just sound." "I remember sounds." She laughed then, soft but wrong, a sound that made the hairs on Miss Wren's neck prickle. The mistress appeared at the doorway almost instantly, her tone sharp. "Sarah Ann, I told you to stay away from the schoolroom." Sarah's smile lingered. "I wanted to learn." Mrs. Calder's eyes narrowed. "You learn nothing that belongs to me." Miss Wren hesitated, uncomfortable. "She's only a child, ma'am. There's no harm." "There's every harm," the mistress interrupted. "She repeats what she hears. She turns holy words into mockery." Sarah's face fell then, the first time anyone had seen her look ashamed. But it didn't last. She straightened, stood on her toes, and mimicked the mistress's voice perfectly. "There's every harm." The room went silent. The mistress's lips thinned, her hand trembling on the doorframe. "Take her away," she hissed, "and don't let her near this room again." Her mother came that evening, pulling Sarah by the wrist, whispering, "Child, why can't you stop?" Sarah's answer was soft, nearly lost to the hum of crickets outside. "When I don't talk like them, they don't hear me at all." Later that night, Miss Wren wrote in her journal, "There is something wrong about that girl's laughter. Not wicked, but wounded. As though she mocks the world because it first mocked her." By the time August rolled in, the air was so heavy with heat that even the trees seemed to sag under it. The river had shrunk into a slow-moving ribbon of brown water, and tempers burned just as hot as the weather. The mistress had stopped pretending to ignore Sarah Ann. Now, every time she heard the faint sound of laughter, her jaw tightened, and her eyes searched for the girl like a hawk hunting a mouse. One afternoon, the house was bustling. The Reverend and his wife were coming for supper, and Mrs. Calder was determined to prove her refinement hadn't decayed with the land. Every servant moved fast and quiet. Sarah wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the house, but that never stopped her. She stood just outside the parlour window, peering through the glass. Inside, the mistress rehearsed her greetings with Miss Wren, her voice clipped and sweet as poison. "Grace," she said, "must always begin in the home." Sarah smiled. She mouthed the words back to herself, then whispered them aloud in the same high, careful tone. "Grace must always begin in the home." Her mimicry was flawless, too flawless. She giggled softly, and that was the moment Mrs. Calder saw her reflection in the glass. The mistress turned, her expression freezing in place. "You," she hissed, stepping to the door. "Come here." Sarah hesitated, but curiosity tugged her closer. "I was only mocking me again?" the mistress snapped. "I was practicing," Sarah said softly, "like Miss Wren do." "Don't you lie to me, girl." The room had gone still. Miss Wren rose halfway from her chair, uncertain, but the mistress's glare held her silent. Mrs. Calder grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her into the parlour. "You think you can make a fool of me? Before the Reverend himself?" Her voice trembled, brittle as glass. Sarah's eyes welled, but not with tears, confusion, maybe. "I ain't making fun," she whispered. "I just sound like you 'cause you the loudest voice." The words landed like a slap before the hand ever did. The mistress's face flushed red. She raised her hand and struck the child once, then again, harder. The sharp crack of palm on skin echoed through the parlour. Miss Wren gasped. The Reverend's wife, arriving just then at the doorway, froze mid-step, the air between them all thick and choking. Sarah stood silent through it, her cheek bright red, her small hands shaking at her sides. Then she did the one thing no one expected. She laughed. It was soft at first, just a breath of sound, the kind a person makes when something breaks inside them instead of outside. But it grew, small and strange and unstoppable. Mrs. Calder's hand dropped. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Sarah's mother came running moments later, hearing the commotion. She gathered the girl up, whispering her name. Sarah only whispered back, "It's funny how everyone gets quiet when I laugh." That night, the air in the cabin was still and thick with the smell of river mud. Dinah sat at the edge of the bed, her rough hands trembling as she dabbed a damp cloth against Sarah Ann's swollen cheek. The girl didn't flinch. She just stared at the candlelight, her face blank except for the faint trace of a smile that had refused to fade, even after the slap. "Why you keep laughing, child?" her mother whispered. Her voice was low but sharp with something between fear and anger. "You don't understand what you're doing." Sarah blinked. "I wasn't laughing at her, Mama. I just nothing," Dinah cut in. "Ain't no just in this world for folks like us. You laugh at the wrong person, they think you mocking 'em. You make 'em feel small, they gonna show you how big they can be." Sarah tilted her head. "But it don't hurt nobody." Dinah's hand froze mid-air. "It do. You just can't see it yet." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, crickets sang in the grass, and from far off came the creak of a wagon wheel turning down the road. Dinah sighed and brushed her thumb along her daughter's hairline. "You got to learn, baby. Some sounds ain't meant to be heard out loud. You hear me?" Sarah nodded slowly. "But when I don't laugh, it feel like I'm holding my breath too long." Her mother's eyes softened, though her voice stayed firm. "Then you hold it. You hear? You hold it till it hurts. 'Cause hurting a little's better than what they'll do to you if you don't." Sarah didn't answer. Her small hands fidgeted with the hem of her nightdress, and for a moment she looked older than her years, not in wisdom, but in weariness. Dinah exhaled, her body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from loving something you can't protect. "You got my mama's laugh," she said quietly. "She used to do the same when she was scared. Smile when she should have cried. Laugh when she should have run." Sarah looked up. "What happened to her?" Her mother hesitated, eyes fixed on the flickering flame. "She stopped laughing. And the day she did, they stopped hurting her." Silence settled between them. The only sound was the quiet tick of the candle burning down. Sarah turned toward the window. The moonlight slipped through the cracks in the shutters, pale and thin. She said, almost to herself, "I don't think I can stop." Dinah closed her eyes. "Then I'll pray you learn how to hide it." Later that night, when her mother had fallen asleep, Sarah lay awake, staring into the dark. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and forced herself to be still. But when the wind outside groaned through the trees, the sound that slipped from her lips wasn't a sob. It was a small, stifled laugh, like a secret too heavy to keep. The next morning came quiet, heavy with humidity and dust. The cicadas were already shrieking when Sarah Ann wandered toward the edge of the woods that bordered the fields. She wasn't supposed to go there alone, but no one watched her closely anymore. The other children avoided her, and her mother was working near the wash barrels behind the big house. The air smelled of sap and iron. In the shadows of the trees, something small caught her eye, a flash of white against the dirt. It was a bird, a mockingbird, its wing twisted, one eye open but still. Its tiny chest fluttered once, twice, then went still again. Sarah crouched beside it, her breath catching. For a long time, she just watched. "Hey there," she whispered. "You sound like me." Her voice was soft, almost kind. She reached out and touched its wing, but it didn't move. The sound that came from her next wasn't a sob. It was a small, nervous giggle, the kind that bubbles up when the heart doesn't know what else to do. Then she started mimicking the sound it had made, that faint, choking gasp before silence. It came out of her like a song, rising and falling, haunting and wrong. She tried again, copying it perfectly this time. Behind her, a voice gasped. "Lord above," whispered Ruth, who had been walking the path to the creek. She crossed herself, the jug she carried slipping from her fingers. "That child's gone and lost her soul." Sarah turned, startled. "It was hurt," she said, pointing to the bird. "I was just—" Ruth shook her head and backed away, her eyes wide. "Don't touch that thing no more. You leave the dead be." Sarah blinked, confused. "It ain't hurting nobody now." But Ruth was already gone, her skirts snapping behind her as she hurried toward the cabins. Left alone, Sarah looked down again. The bird's small body was still, but its shadow, or maybe just her imagination, seemed to move a little when the breeze came through the trees. She covered it gently with a handful of leaves, pressing them down as if tucking it in. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you now," she said softly. "I'll keep you quiet." Then, as if to prove she could, she pressed her lips together and held her breath. But the silence scared her. It pressed against her ears, made her heart race. And after a moment, she let out a tiny laugh, quick and fragile, breaking through the stillness like a crack in glass. Later, Ruth would tell the others what she saw. "That child laughed at a dying bird," she whispered, "mimicked its last breath like it was a game." By sundown, the story had grown teeth. They said Sarah's laugh called the spirit from the creature and trapped it in her chest. They said that's why her laughter never stopped, because she wasn't the only one inside her anymore. And that night, when her mother came home and found her sitting by the door, quiet and pale, Sarah whispered, "It stopped moving when I did." Then she laughed, just once, soft and hollow, like the echo of something small being buried. By the end of that week, Sarah Ann's name was no longer spoken out loud. It was whispered, half in fear, half in warning. Folks in the quarters began to cross themselves when she walked past, muttering prayers under their breath. Mothers pulled their little ones closer, saying, "Don't look at her too long, child. She'll make your dreams turn bad." The story about the bird had spread faster than summer fire. What started as Ruth's frightened account had grown by every tongue it touched. By the time it reached the far cabins, Sarah wasn't just a strange child anymore. She was marked. They said she could steal the breath from the living, that her laughter wasn't hers but the devil's joy, that she'd been born under a cursed moon with a foot in both worlds. And the overseer, a tall man with a pitted face named Mr. Harrow, seemed to enjoy every word of it. "I ain't never seen a sound like that come from a child," he said one evening at the fire when the men gathered to smoke. "That laugh of hers," he shook his head, "makes my bones go cold. Bet she's got something crawling in her blood that ought to be burned out." The next morning, when Sarah passed by on her way to the creek, he spat in the dirt and made the sign of a cross in the dust. "Best stay out of the fields, girl," he said, his voice oily. "Ain't no place for a devil's echo." Sarah looked up at him, blinking in the sunlight. "You the one sounding like a devil," she said softly. "All that spit and noise." The men nearby froze. Harrow's eyes went dark. He took a step toward her, but before he could speak, she started laughing again, not loud, but steady, like she'd turned his anger into a rhythm. He stopped short, his skin prickling. "Get away from me, child." She tilted her head. "I ain't near you." That night, thunder rolled across a sky that had been clear just an hour before. Lightning struck the old mule barn, setting the roof ablaze. The men ran with buckets, shouting into the storm. By morning, all that was left was black ash and the smell of smoke. God's punishment, someone whispered. He's telling us to drive that laugh off this land. Even the mistress seemed quieter after the fire. She told her husband, I won't have that child's noise on my porch again. It's unholy, and so Sarah was told to stay near the cabins, away from the house, away from the fields. Her mother obeyed, though every part of her wanted to defy it. But that night, when the frogs began their endless croaking, Sarah sat outside alone, humming softly to herself. I think they scared of the wrong thing, she said to the dark. They scared of sound. But I'm scared of silence. And the wind seemed to agree, because it moved through the trees like a voice that couldn't rest. The first cold wind of the year came early that autumn, and with it came death. One of the overseer's sons, a boy not much older than Sarah Ann, was thrown from his horse and broke his neck on the road near the river. The whole plantation went still after the news. Even the mistress, who rarely showed anything but contempt, wore black for a week. On the morning of the burial, everyone was made to attend, the housefolk, the field hands, even the children. They stood in the churchyard, a scatter of bowed heads beneath grey skies. The preacher's voice was deep and slow, his words floating like smoke over the open grave. Sarah stood near the back, holding her mother's hand. She didn't understand the sermon, but she watched the faces, the tears, the trembling lips, the way the air itself seemed to grow heavy with sorrow. The coffin was small, polished pine, and when they lowered it into the ground, someone sobbed so loud it startled a flock of crows from the trees. The sound broke the stillness, and in that break, something inside Sarah twisted. It started as a nervous breath, then another. A small, trembling sound escaped her throat before she could stop it. She laughed, not loud, not mocking, just soft, a sound that didn't belong in that place, on that morning, in that silence. The preacher stopped mid-verse. The mistress turned, her eyes wide with shock, her face draining of colour. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as if the air itself cracked, people began to whisper. Her mother's hand clamped down on hers. "Sarah," Dinah hissed. "Hush!" But Sarah couldn't. The laughter spilled again, shaking, unsure, almost like a sob that forgot how to cry. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but it came out wrapped in a giggle. The overseer stepped forward, his face red. "What's wrong with that child?" he barked. "You bring her here to mock the dead." Dinah dropped to her knees beside her daughter. "She don't mean it," she cried. "She don't understand." Mrs. Calder's voice sliced through the noise. "Take her away." Now Sarah's laughter stopped as suddenly as it began. The silence that followed was worse, tight, choking, and cold. She stared up at the rows of faces, the preacher's lips pressed into a grim line, the mistress's fury trembling just behind her poise. "I wasn't laughing at him," she said softly. "I was laughing because everyone looked like they was holding their breath." I wanted to help 'em let it out, but no one believed her. That evening, the whispers began again. She laughed at a grave, they said, at death itself. By nightfall, the mistress had made up her mind. "That child's not right," she told her husband. "She's a sickness. And I'll not have her laughter curse this house any longer." And as the last light left the sky, Dinah held her daughter close and felt the first tremor of something she couldn't name, the sound of fate tightening its grip. They came for her before dawn. The sky was still the color of ash when the knock came, sharp, impatient. Dinah opened the door, already knowing what it meant. Two of the housemen stood there with lanterns, their faces hard in the pale light. Behind them, the mistress's silhouette waited at the edge of the path, wrapped in her mourning shawl like a judge cloaked in shadow. "Mrs. Calder says the girl's to be brought to the cellar," one of the men said. "She'll stay there till she learns to hold her tongue." Dinah stepped in front of Sarah, who sat up on her pallet, her eyes wide and bleary with sleep. "She's just a child," Dinah pleaded. "She don't mean harm." "She laughed at the overseer's boy's funeral," the man said flatly. "That's harm enough." Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Mama, I ain't done nothing." Dinah's voice trembled. "You hush, baby. Just stay quiet, you hear?" But the men were already moving. They grabbed Sarah by the arm, and though she kicked and twisted, their grip was iron. One of them muttered, "Best she learn her place now before the devil takes her whole." Mrs. Calder watched in silence as they dragged the girl across the yard. The sun was just beginning to rise, throwing long shadows across the damp earth. When Sarah stumbled, the mistress spoke for the first time. "You bring shame into every room you walk in," she said coldly. "Maybe the dark will teach you what the light could not." Dinah fell to her knees, crying out, "Please! Don't shut her down there. She's scared of the dark." But Mrs. Calder didn't even look at her. "So was my son," she said, her voice low, "and yet he stayed there." The cellar was a narrow pit beneath the old smokehouse, damp, windowless, and lined with stone. The men shoved Sarah inside and closed the door. The latch fell into place with a sound that seemed to echo forever. At first, there was silence, then a small knock. "Mama," Sarah whispered, "I can't see." Dinah pressed her palms to the wood, her tears soaking into the grain. "You just be still, baby. I'm right here." But when she leaned close, she could hear it, that faint, trembling sound rising from the dark. Laughter, not bright, not mischievous, but cracked and hollow, like something breaking apart. Mrs. Calder turned away from the sound, her face unreadable. "Leave her be," she said. "She'll come out when she forgets how to laugh." By midday, the laughter had faded. By nightfall, only silence came from behind the cellar door. Dinah sat there through the dark, her hands still pressed to the wood, whispering prayers she didn't believe in. And when the first breeze of dawn swept through the yard, she thought she heard a voice drift up from the cracks, soft, thin, and distant. "Mama, I'm trying to be quiet now." For the first few days, the plantation moved slower, quieter, as if the land itself was listening. The laughter that had once floated through the air, that strange, misplaced sound, was gone. But the silence that replaced it wasn't peace. It was weight. The cellar beneath the smokehouse stayed locked. Dinah sat beside the door from sunrise to nightfall, whispering prayers, humming lullabies, pressing her ear to the wood. Sometimes she thought she heard her daughter breathing, faint, uneven, like the tide of a shallow sea. Sometimes she heard nothing at all. On the third day, she brought a bowl of water and a bit of bread. "Sarah," she called softly, "I got you something. You eat now, baby." For a long while, there was no sound. Then, from deep in the dark, a voice came, weak, soft, but clear. "I ain't hungry, Mama. I've been laughing to keep warm." Dinah's chest tightened. "Hush now, don't say that. You save your strength." But Sarah's voice drifted again, dreamy and strange. "It's funny. When I laugh, it don't sound like me no more. It sound like something else." Dinah pressed her forehead against the door, tears cutting through the dirt on her face. "That ain't funny, Sarah Ann. You stop that talk, you hear?" The girl didn't answer. Only a small hum followed, a shaky, tuneless thing that faded into quiet. By the fifth day, the whispers started. The field hands said they'd heard giggling in the middle of the night, drifting across the yard like wind. One woman swore she saw the candle flame in her cabin flicker in rhythm with the sound, as if the laughter was breathing with her. The overseer told them to shut up and keep working, but even he avoided walking past the smokehouse after sunset. Miss Wren tried once to intervene. "She's a child," she said to Mrs. Calder. "You can't leave her in there. She'll lose her mind." The mistress didn't look up from her sewing. If madness is what lives in her, then perhaps the dark will keep it company. That night, a storm rolled in. Rain hammered the tin roof, lightning tore across the sky, and thunder shook the ground. In the middle of it all, Dinah swore she heard her daughter's laughter again, faint but clear, woven into the rhythm of the rain. She ran to the cellar barefoot, mud splashing her legs, and pounded on the door. "Sarah, Sarah Ann, you answer me." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, through the roar of thunder, came a whisper, so close it could have been right beside her ear. "Mama, I think I'm learning to be quiet now." And then nothing. When morning came, the storm had passed. The air was clean, the fields washed in pale sunlight, but the cellar door stayed shut. No sound came from behind it. and for the first time, Dinah realized that silence could be louder than laughter ever was. By the fourth morning, Dinah could no longer pray. Her voice had gone raw from pleading, her knees bruised from kneeling in the dirt by the cellar door. She'd stopped eating. Every sound from inside, every shuffle, every sigh, twisted her chest until she could hardly breathe. When she went to the big house to beg again, the servants looked away. They'd learned not to meet her eyes, as though her desperation might stain them too. She found Mrs. Calder on the veranda, her hair neatly pinned, her Bible open in her lap. The woman's calm made Dinah's heart burn. "Ma'am," Dinah began, her voice breaking, "please, let her out. She's just a baby. She's learning her lesson, I swear she is." Mrs. Calder didn't look up. "A baby who mocks the dead deserves to learn respect. She'll stay where she is until I'm satisfied she's changed." "She's changing, ma'am," Dinah said. "Too much. She ain't eating, ain't sleeping." She whispered to herself in the dark. Mrs. Calder finally lifted her gaze, her eyes cold and still. "You say that as if I should pity her." Dinah's voice rose despite herself. "You don't have to pity her. Just let her breathe." The sound cracked across the yard. A slave's voice raised against the mistress. A servant nearby froze mid-step. Mrs. Calder's expression didn't flicker, but her words cut like glass. "Watch your tone, woman. The child has poisoned your sense of place. You forget who you're speaking to." Dinah took a step closer. "I know who I'm speaking to. The one who took my child's light and buried it in a hole." That earned her a slap. Sharp, quick, the kind meant not to wound, but to remind. Dinah stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. Mrs. Calder stood, her posture unshaken. "I have lost a child," she said. "You'll not shame me for wanting silence where there was disrespect." Dinah's eyes filled, but not with tears, with rage. "You lost your child, yes, but you still got walls and food and breath. Mine's losing all that right now, and you call it discipline." The mistress turned away, her voice soft but final. "God knows what he's doing. Perhaps silence is his mercy." Dinah's lips trembled. "If he's merciful, he ain't looking at you." That night, she disobeyed. When the house went dark and the crickets began their nightly song, Dinah crept to the smokehouse, carrying a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth. She pressed her ear to the door. No sound came. "Sarah," she whispered. "Baby, it's Mama." The air was heavy and still. Then, faintly, came a voice, thin as thread. "Mama, I ain't laughing no more." Dinah's knees gave way. She dropped the bread and clawed at the latch, but it wouldn't budge. Her sobs filled the yard, low, ragged, breaking open the quiet. And somewhere inside the dark, the child's voice whispered again, softer this time, as if she were speaking from somewhere far away. "I think I did what she wanted." By the seventh morning, the cellar had gone quiet. Not just still. Empty quiet. The kind that makes even the wind seem afraid to pass by. No one had gone near it since the mistress's last order, not Dinah, not the field hands, not even Mr. Harrow, who claimed not to fear the devil himself. But on that morning, Ruth, the cook who'd known Dinah since they were girls, couldn't take the silence any longer. "She's just a child," Ruth said, clutching her shawl tight as she approached the smokehouse. "No sin in this world deserves that much dark." The air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The door creaked when she touched it. "Sarah Ann?" she called softly. "Baby, you hear me?" No answer. She knelt, pressed her ear to the seam where light met shadow, and for a moment thought she heard something. Not laughter, not crying, but the faint scrape of movement. "Lord help me," she murmured. "I'm opening this door." The latch was rusted, but gave way with a groan. When the door swung open, the smell hit first. Stale air, wet earth, something sour underneath. Ruth held the lantern up and peered inside. Sarah sat in the far corner, knees drawn to her chest. Her dress was dirty, her curls matted, her lips cracked white. When the light touched her, she flinched, blinking like a creature dragged from a dream. "Baby," Ruth's voice broke. Sweet Jesus. Sarah's eyes lifted slowly. There was a smile on her face, faint and trembling, but her voice, when it came, was flat, too calm. You come to make it stop. Ruth swallowed hard. Make what stop, baby? Sarah tilted her head. The sound. What sound? The laughing. It's still going. Even when I don't, Ruth felt a chill crawl up her arms. There ain't no laughing, child. Ain't been none for days. Sarah blinked. Then who's talking to me? The lantern light trembled in Ruth's hand. She stepped closer and saw the girl's fingernails, torn and dirty, little half-moons of blood beneath them. Oh, Lord. Don't tell Mama, Sarah whispered. She'll be sad. I've been trying to do what the lady said. I've been real quiet. Her words broke something inside Ruth. Come on now, baby. Let's get you out of this place. Sarah shook her head weakly. She'll get mad. She said I had to stay till I forgot how to laugh. Ruth reached out, her fingers trembling. Ain't nobody mad. You just come with me, you hear? But before she could lift her, the girl looked past her, toward the light creeping in through the doorway, and smiled faintly. I think I did it, she whispered. I forgot. Then her head drooped forward, the small body going limp in Ruth's arms. The sound that escaped the older woman wasn't a scream, but a deep, broken wail, the kind that comes from the soul itself. Ruth carried her out into the sunlight, whispering over and over, Lord, forgive us. She only wanted to be heard. The sun had barely broken the horizon when Dinah saw Ruth running up from the smokehouse, her apron streaked with mud, her face pale as bone. Dinah, she cried, breathless. She's alive, but she ain't right. Dinah didn't wait for more. Her legs moved before thought, her feet pounding the wet earth until she reached the smokehouse door. It hung open now, the smell of damp and sorrow thick in the air. Inside, Ruth knelt beside Sarah Ann, who lay wrapped in a threadbare blanket, her head resting against a basket of rags. The child's eyes were open but unfocused, her lips dry and cracked, her small chest lifting in shallow, uneven breaths. Mama, she whispered when Dinah dropped to her knees beside her. Dinah gathered her up, holding her so close it seemed she wanted to pull the girl back into her own body. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Sarah blinked slowly, her lashes trembling. I've been real quiet, she murmured. You ain't got to be quiet no more, you hear me? Dinah said, brushing the dirt from her daughter's face with shaking fingers. You done enough. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest smile. She said I got to stop laughing. You don't listen to her, Dinah whispered fiercely. You listen to me. The girl's eyes moved lazily toward the doorway, where sunlight filtered through the cracks. It's bright, she said softly. I forgot it could be that bright. Ruth stood a few steps back, tears streaking her face. We need water, she whispered, and someone fetch Miss Wren. Maybe she can help. But Dinah barely heard. She was rocking her child like she'd done when she was a baby, humming a song her own mother used to sing, a lullaby without words. Sarah lifted a trembling hand to touch her mother's face. Mama, she said, her voice barely a breath, when I was in the dark, I heard you talking. Dinah nodded quickly, tears dripping from her chin. I never stopped. I tried to laugh, Sarah whispered, so you'd know I was still there. Dinah's heart cracked wide open. Oh, baby. Sarah's next words came faint, broken by the air catching in her throat. I ain't laughing no more. Her small hand fell away, fingers brushing against her mother's arm. Dinah froze, waiting for another breath, another word, but none came, only stillness. For a moment, the world itself seemed to stop breathing too. Then, a sound rose from Dinah, not a scream, not even a cry, but something raw and ancient. The kind of sound that could split the heavens. Outside, the sky dimmed as clouds gathered over the plantation. The wind picked up, swirling dust and magnolia petals into the air. Ruth sank to her knees and whispered through her sobs, Lord, have mercy. She'd done gone home, and in that strange, still moment, before the storm broke, Dinah could have sworn she heard it again, faint and far, floating through the fields. a single broken laugh, softer than a sigh. The day Sarah Ann died, the air hung thick and grey, heavy with the promise of rain that refused to fall. The news moved through the plantation like smoke, slow, curling, finding its way into every mouth and every silence. No one spoke her name above a whisper. Some crossed themselves when they heard it. Others turned their faces away, pretending not to feel the tremor that passed through the ground when her mother's wail split the dawn. Dinah didn't stop crying for hours. The sound rose and fell like the tide, echoing through the quarters, crawling up the walls of the big house. It was a sound too human to ignore and too painful to confront. From her window, Mrs. Calder listened, her jaw set, her fingers clenched around the edge of her Bible. "She brought this on herself," she said softly, as if saying it enough times would make it true. But her hand trembled. The sound of that mourning, the pure, wordless grief, rattled something buried deep inside her. In the quarters, Ruth and the other women washed the girl's small body in silence. She looked almost peaceful now, her features smooth, her lips faintly parted. The bruises on her wrists had begun to fade. Ruth covered them with the cleanest cloth she could find. "She don't look cursed," one woman whispered. "She looked like she'd just sleepin'." Dinah sat beside her, rocking slightly, humming that same tune she'd used to comfort her in life. But the song had no melody now, just breath, just rhythm. "She was only a child," Ruth said softly. Dinah's eyes stayed fixed on the face before her. "She was my voice," she whispered, "and now it's gone quiet." When the men came to take the body, she didn't move at first. They waited, hats in hand, unsure whether to touch her or speak. Finally, Ruth placed a hand on Dinah's shoulder. "Let her rest, honey." Dinah lifted her head, eyes hollow but dry now. "Ain't no rest for a child that died for sound." She stood, wrapped the small form in a white sheet, and carried her herself. She wouldn't let the men take her, not the ones who'd turned away when the cellar door closed. She walked slow, each step steady, her bare feet sinking into the mud. Behind her, the women followed, singing low under their breath, an old song about freedom and rivers and home. They buried Sarah Ann at the edge of the magnolia grove, where the roots reached deep and the ground stayed soft. The mistress forbade the service, but they prayed anyway. Dinah didn't cry this time. She just pressed her palm against the dirt, her voice calm and steady. "She learned your silence," she said to the sky. "Now hear mine." When night fell, no laughter rose from the quarters. No songs, no talking. Only the sound of the wind moving through the trees, slow and mournful, like the earth itself was learning how to grieve. And for the first time since the girl's birth, the Calder plantation was truly quiet. They buried her at night, not because they wanted to, but because the mistress forbade a funeral for a blasphemous child. The order came at sunset, cold and final. No gathering, no singing, no tears where I can hear them. But the people on that land had learned long ago that grief doesn't obey orders. So when the moon climbed over the magnolia grove, pale and swollen in the humid air, they came, one by one, barefoot and silent, each carrying something small. A candle stub, a flower, a scrap of cloth. Dinah led the way, her face lit by the lantern Ruth carried. Her steps were slow, deliberate, the earth soft beneath her bare feet. Behind her, the field hands followed in solemn quiet, their shadows stretching long and thin between the trees. They had dug the grave earlier that evening, shallow, careful, near the roots of the oldest magnolia. The air there smelled of sap and wet bark, and when the wind moved, the branches whispered like voices too tired to speak. Sarah Ann lay wrapped in a white sheet, her curls brushed, her hands folded over her chest. Ruth had placed a small magnolia blossom in her palm. "For beauty," she'd said, "since the world wouldn't let her have any while she was here." Dinah knelt at the grave's edge, her body trembling with the kind of stillness that comes after all the tears are gone. For a long while, no one spoke. Then she began to hum, that same wordless tune she'd sung beside the cellar door. Only this time, others joined her. Low voices filled the grove. Deep, aching notes that rose into the night and tangled in the branches. It wasn't a hymn the mistress would have recognized. It wasn't for her. It was older, a song carried from across the ocean, reshaped through generations of sorrow. When the last verse faded, Dinah whispered, "She laughed when the world told her not to, and maybe that's what made her brave." She placed a smooth stone at the head of the grave. It wasn't marked, just heavy and round, something she'd taken from the riverbank where her daughter used to play. Then, one by one, the others followed. Each dropped something small into the dirt: a ribbon, a dried corn husk, a feather, a piece of thread. The gifts of those who had little to give but memory. When it was done, Dinah rose, her face pale in the moonlight. "If her laugh scared 'em," she said softly, "then they'll never know peace, 'cause I'll keep it alive in me." Ruth reached for her hand, and together they turned toward the fields. The lantern flickered as they walked, their shadows crossing the soil like ghosts still working the land. By morning, the grave looked untouched. The magnolia tree stood still, its blossoms half open, white as bone in the early light. But those who'd been there swore that when the wind passed through its branches, they heard a sound, faint, light, almost like a child's laugh carried on the breeze. Not mocking, not cursed, just remembered. The days after the burial passed like shadows, slow, heavy, and without color. The air on the Calder plantation changed. The laughter that once echoed from the quarters, the murmured songs that floated across the fields, the chatter between the women at the wash line, all of it faded. It was as if Sarah Ann's absence had swallowed the very sound of life. Even the birds were quiet. Dinah didn't speak, not once, not to Ruth, not to the others, not even to herself. She rose each morning before dawn, worked until her hands bled, and returned to the same small cabin where her daughter's pallet still lay untouched. The tiny wooden doll Sarah had made from scraps sat by the window, its carved smile cracked from the heat. Sometimes Ruth brought her food, most times it went cold. "She don't eat, she don't cry," Ruth told the others. "She just work and stare." They whispered that grief had made her mute, or that she'd made a promise to her child, to never speak again in a world that punished sound. Mrs. Calder noticed the change too. At first, she was relieved by the quiet. "Peace at last," she'd murmured to her husband one morning, sipping her coffee on the veranda. "It's as if the whole place has finally learned reverence." But as the weeks passed, peace began to feel like rot. The plantation ran slower. The workers moved like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their voices low. Even the animals seemed restless, their movements jerky, nervous. And at night, something else began. The mistress couldn't sleep. She told herself it was the humidity, or the creaking boards, or the rustle of the magnolia branches outside her window. But then she heard it, faint, almost a trick of the wind. A sound that crawled up through the floorboards when the house went still. A laugh, soft, distant, the kind that didn't belong to the living. She rose from bed, candle trembling in her hand, and walked the halls. The sound seemed to follow her, a whisper of mirth where there should have been none. By the time she reached the staircase, it had stopped. Only her heart was making noise now, beating too fast in the silence. The next morning she told her husband the house needed a priest. "To bless it," she said quickly, "to drive out what lingers." He only looked at her, his face pale, his hands shaking from drink. "You put her in that hole," he muttered. "Now you live with the quiet." She slapped him, but the words stayed, heavy as truth. In the quarters, Dinah worked by the river, silent as ever. She hadn't spoken in so long that the others started talking around her like she wasn't there. But sometimes, when the wind blew from the grove, she would pause mid-motion, her head turning slightly, as if she were listening. And once, just once, Ruth swore she saw the corners of Dinah's mouth twitch, not in a smile, not in a laugh, but in something caught between sorrow and remembrance. Because silence, she had learned, could be the loudest thing a mother leaves behind. By early winter, the mistress had begun to lose sleep entirely. At first, she told herself it was the heat that clung to the rooms even after the fire died down. Then she blamed the noises, the settling of wood, the scratching of rats in the walls. But deep down, Mrs. Calder knew better. It wasn't the house creaking. It was her conscience breathing. It started small. The sound came only when the nights were stillest, a faint, stifled giggle carried on the draught that slipped through the hallway. Sometimes it was so soft that she thought she imagined it. Other times it came clearer, a child's laughter, brittle and breathy, as if trying to remember how to be happy. She told no one at first, but soon her nerves betrayed her. Servants began to whisper about the way she startled at every noise, how she flinched when she heard children's voices in the yard. Then one night she woke to the sound again, close this time, just beyond the bed curtains. A high, broken sound, like breath caught between sob and joy. She sat up, heart hammering, candle trembling in her hand. "Who's there?" Only silence. Then, faintly, almost kindly, a whisper, "You told me to be quiet." The candle slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor. The next morning she called Miss Wren to the parlour. The missionary had been preparing to leave the plantation for months, but the mistress begged her to stay. "You read the Bible," she said, her voice trembling. "You speak to God. Tell me, can guilt make a soul sound like a child?" Miss Wren blinked, uncertain. "What is it you've been hearing, ma'am?" Mrs. Calder's hands twisted in her lap. "Laughter," she whispered. "A little girl's laughter. It comes from nowhere, and it doesn't stop when I pray." Miss Wren hesitated, then said softly, "Perhaps it's not a haunting, but a memory. God has many ways to remind us of our trespasses." The mistress's face hardened. "You think this is punishment?" "I think it's conscience," the teacher said simply. "And that's worse." That night, the laughter came again. This time it filled the hallway, bouncing off the walls, low and steady. The mistress rose, her breath ragged, and followed it through the corridor until she reached the door to the nursery, a room that hadn't been opened since her own son died. Her hand trembled on the latch. She pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The moonlight spilled through the lace curtains, silvering the rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, back and forth, and though no one sat in it, the air around it seemed to hum. Mrs. Calder's lips parted, her eyes filling with something between horror and awe. "I told her to stop laughing," she whispered, and she did. The chair creaked again, slow, rhythmic, and the sound that rose from the shadows this time wasn't laughter at all. It was breathing. Time doesn't stop on the land, even when the people on it wish it would. Seasons kept turning over the Calder plantation like the pages of a book that no one wanted to keep reading. The fields grew wild where they once grew orderly. The house sagged a little more each year, paint peeled, shutters hung loose, and vines crept up the veranda as if trying to pull the house back into the earth that had fed it. Sarah Ann's name was still whispered, but now in stories told to frighten children into obedience. "Don't laugh when grown folk are talking," they'd say. "The laughing girl might hear you." The tale grew and twisted like roots, every mouth adding something new. In one version, she'd cursed the land before she died. In another, her laughter could still be heard in the magnolia grove, warning of death or storm. But the truth, the simple, awful truth, was quieter. It lived in Dinah's silence. Years passed, and Dinah grew old. Her back bent from years of labor, her hair silvered by grief rather than time. She never left the plantation, not because she couldn't, but because something of her child was still buried in its soil. She tended the magnolia tree like it was holy ground, trimming the weeds, leaving a bit of bread or a flower by the roots. Sometimes the younger women asked her why. She'd just press her fingers to her lips and shake her head. Even Mrs. Calder had changed, though pride wouldn't let her admit it. Her hair had gone white early, and she seldom left her room. The laughter she once feared now followed her in dreams. She'd wake gasping in the dark, her throat tight, the echo of a giggle still ringing in her ears. She tried to pray it away, tried to tell herself that the sound was just memory. But every time she heard it, she felt that same flicker of shame, the face of the child she had buried alive beneath her anger. When the war came and the land began to crumble under new hands, the Calder name faded. The house was sold, then abandoned. The fields grew thick with weeds, the fence line splintered, and the magnolia grove swallowed what was left of the family plot. By then, only a handful of people remembered the real story. Most had turned it into folklore, something safe, something distant. But those who'd known Dinah remembered the way she'd stand under that tree each evening, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something she could hear but no one else could. And sometimes, on windless days when the air was still and the sun sat low, a sound would drift across the fields. Not loud, not mocking, just soft and strange, like the earth itself remembering how to laugh. It was more than 30 years before anyone spoke Sarah Ann's name aloud again. By then, the Calder plantation was a ruin, a skeleton of columns and charred beams half swallowed by vines. The war had stripped it bare, the family long gone, and only a handful of the old hands remained, scattered across the county, carrying stories in their bones. One of them was Ruth, her hair now silver and her back bent like the bow of a worn oak. She lived with her granddaughter in a small cabin near the river, her hands still strong enough to shell peas, her voice rough from time. Most days she didn't talk much about the old days, but one evening, when the air was still and the crickets began their hum, the little girl asked, "Grandma, is it true there was once a girl who laughed when nobody else could?" Ruth looked up from her work, her eyes distant. "Who told you that?" "Miss Ella at church. She said the laughing girl lived round here once." For a moment, Ruth said nothing. Then she sighed and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the trees where the magnolia grove used to be. "Ain't no ghost story, child. It was a real girl. I knew her. Lord, I wish I hadn't." The girl's eyes widened. "Was she bad?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "No. She was good, just different. The world don't like different. She laughed when she should have cried, and they thought that meant she was cursed. But truth is, she was the only one brave enough to make a sound in a place that lived on silence." The little girl frowned. "Why'd they hurt her?" "'Cause she made 'em see themselves," Ruth said, her voice heavy. "That laugh of hers, it weren't mocking. It was like a mirror. Folks don't like what they see when their wrongs get echoed back to 'em." The wind picked up outside, rustling the trees. Ruth's eyes softened as if she were seeing something long gone. "I still hear her sometimes. Not like a ghost, more like a memory that won't stay quiet." "Is she still out there?" the child asked in a whisper. Ruth smiled faintly. "Maybe. Maybe she just found a place where laughing don't get punished." The girl thought about that for a long time, then leaned her head against her grandmother's knee. "I think I'd like her," she said. Ruth's hand paused mid-motion. "Everybody liked her," she whispered. "Just too late." Outside, the sun dipped low, staining the sky red and gold, and as the wind moved through the trees, Ruth closed her eyes. She could almost hear it again, soft, far off, the sound of a child's laugh drifting through the years. And for the first time in decades, Ruth smiled, not because it was funny, because it was forgiven. By the time Ruth was gone, Sarah Ann's story had already left the plantation and drifted into the town beyond it, reshaped, retold, and repurposed by tongues that never knew her. The truth had grown thin from use, but her name still lingered like smoke after a fire. Children in the small towns along the river whispered about the laughing girl. They said she had lived in the woods behind the old Calder place, and that if you laughed too loud at night, she'd come for you, not to hurt you, but to take your voice away, so you could never laugh again. Parents used her story as warning. "Don't mock your elders," they'd say. "Don't laugh at the churchyard. Don't talk back when grown folks speak." And if a child giggled during prayer, someone would whisper, "Hush," before she hears you. The real story, the girl who had simply been different, who had loved sound in a world that worshipped silence, was lost beneath the layers of fear. Yet every version still carried a trace of her truth, like an echo that refused to fade. One traveling preacher told it differently. He said there was a child once who could hear sorrow and turn it into laughter. But the people, he'd say from his pulpit, they mistook her gift for wickedness. So the Lord took her laughter and left her silence to teach them shame. The congregation would murmur in agreement, never realizing the story was about a sin older than faith, the sin of cruelty dressed up as righteousness. As years turned to decades, the Calder plantation fell deeper into ruin. The house became a skeleton of itself, the roof caved in, the windows empty, the magnolia grove overgrown. Yet every spring, people claimed the same strange thing. When the trees bloomed, the petals fell faster near the old graves, and if the wind blew just right, a sound would rise from the grove, faint, trembling, like breath caught between sob and song. Some swore it was the wind through hollow branches. Others said it was her, the girl who forgot how to laugh. By then, no one remembered her name, just the child who mocked death, or the cursed one. But in the hearts of those who had heard the older stories, the ones that hadn't been told in church or written in books, there remained something gentler, a belief that maybe she hadn't been cursed at all. Maybe her laughter had been too honest for a place built on lies. Maybe it had never been laughter they feared, only truth. And sometimes, when the river fog rolled in at dusk, travellers passing by the overgrown road would hear a sound that made them stop and look over their shoulders. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't joyful. It was something else entirely. A laugh that sounded like mercy. More than a century later, what remained of the Calder plantation was little more than bones. Crumbling brick chimneys jutted from the earth like gravestones. The magnolia grove had swallowed most of the land, its thick roots pushing through collapsed walls and warped floorboards. Time had done what fire and guilt could not. It had erased almost everything. Almost. Dr. Eleanor Price, a young historian from Charleston, arrived one damp afternoon, her boots sinking into the wet earth. She had come searching for the truth behind a legend she'd grown up hearing, the laughing girl of the Calder plantation. To most, it was just southern folklore, but Eleanor didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in people and in the traces they leave behind. She walked the grounds with her notebook, her pencil trembling as she wrote. The air smelled of rain and magnolia bloom, sweet and heavy. The old river path was barely visible, but when she followed it, she found a patch of land where the grass grew softer, greener. It was there, beneath the shadow of a massive tree, that she saw it, a small round stone half sunken into the soil. No name, no date, just stillness. Eleanor knelt and brushed the dirt away. Beneath the moss, she found a faint carving, the shape of a magnolia blossom, weathered nearly smooth. She stayed there a long time. The wind shifted through the branches, and for a moment she thought she heard something, faint and distant, like the echo of a child's hum carried on the air. Later, back in the old courthouse archives, she pieced together the fragments. A record of a slave named Dinah, a mention of a girl confined for insolence, a faded letter from a missionary teacher named E. Wren, dated 1852. The child laughed when the world demanded silence, Miss Wren had written. She was punished not for her sin, but for her sound. Eleanor's hand trembled as she copied the line into her notebook. That evening, she returned to the site. The magnolia tree loomed in the twilight, its blossoms glowing pale in the fading light. She lit a candle and set it at the base of the stone. For Sarah, she whispered, the name she'd found in a half-burned ledger, for the one who laughed. The candle flame flickered, mirrored faintly in a puddle by her feet. As she stood there, the air grew still, and then, soft, so soft she almost doubted it, came a sound, not quite laughter, not quite crying, something in between. Eleanor smiled through her tears. "I hear you," she whispered. When she left, the candle burned steady, the magnolia petals drifting down around it like snow, and for the first time in more than 100 years, someone had said the child's name with kindness. Morning came slowly over the river, turning the mist into threads of gold. The air was still, the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. The magnolia tree stood tall and old, its branches heavy with blooms, white petals drifting down to rest on the water below. No one lived there anymore, not a soul for miles. The old road to the Calder place had long since vanished beneath weeds and roots, and the only visitors now were the wind, the birds, and the stories people still whispered. But if someone had been there at dawn, standing by the riverbank, they might have seen it. The faint shimmer of two reflections in the water, side by side. Not shapes, not ghosts, just the play of light on moving current, like the memory of faces the world had forgotten to remember. The candle Dr. Price had left by the stone had burned down to nothing overnight. Its last bit of wax had hardened against the moss, the wick black and cold. Yet the earth around it looked brighter somehow, as if the ground itself had caught the light and decided to keep it. A breeze moved through the magnolia branches, scattering petals across the grave. They floated down like snow, soft and endless, each one settling with the gentlest of sighs. And when the wind changed, just for a moment, a sound came with it. Not laughter exactly, not crying either, something between them, a hum, a breath, a sound that felt alive. It rippled through the grove, touched the grass, stirred the river, then was gone. But those who still spoke of the Calder plantation, the locals, the travellers, the ones who swore the land still remembered, said that on quiet mornings, if you stand under that magnolia and listen hard enough, you can hear it. A child's voice, soft, warm, unafraid, not haunting, not angry, just free. They said the laugh doesn't mock anymore, it forgives. And if you hear it, you'll find yourself smiling, though you won't know why. Because maybe that's what Sarah Ann's laughter had been all along, not defiance, not madness, but the last true sound of innocence in a place that had forgotten what mercy sounded like. The river kept flowing, the petals kept falling, and somewhere between the roots and the water and the wind, the world still carried her sound, light, trembling and eternal. Because silence, in the end, can't hold what was born to be heard. And laughter, real laughter, never truly dies. And that was the story of Sarah Ann, the girl who wasn't allowed to laugh, a child who tried to turn pain into sound and was punished for it. Her voice may have been buried, but it still echoes in every forgotten corner where silence once ruled. If you listened closely tonight, maybe you heard it too. Not a haunting, not a curse, just a memory that refuses to fade. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre record. Every night, we uncover the stories history tried to silence, the ones whispered through the cracks of old houses, the ones too human to forget. And tell me in the comments, what do you think Sarah Ann's laughter really meant? Because sometimes, the sound we fear the most is just the truth trying to speak.